I quote, "It will be a dark day for America. We will send their sons home in coffins and in boxes." And he underlined not just people in military uniform, but civilians too. They are all a target of this fatwa, unquote. It was the first time he underscored that this is no longer bin Laden against the forces of the U.S. government. This was bin Laden against the American people, civilians included. It was 6 weeks after he made that statement in July when he, according to U.S. officials, blew up the 2 East African embassies, thus carrying out the threat he made. And he has threatened several times, including once recently, to launch more attacks. In his latest video, essentially claiming credit for the Cole attack, or at least cheering it on.
This was the attack that appeared on Middle East television, and I think occurred at the time of his daughter's or his son's wedding.
It's the one even after that where he released a kind of a training video showing himself shooting guns and showing U.S. leaders and targets and so on. So he has underlined the threat that it's a continuing one.
All right, just to make clear to people at home, we're persisting with the questioning on this issue of anybody we talk to in the Intelligence Committee or with access to it, so that the country does not rush to judgment, even though, as John Miller and Senator Hatch most recently and others, John Cooley, our correspondent in the Middle East, make clear that Osama bin Laden is certainly a logical person to put at the very head of the suspect list. ABC's Brian Ross gives us some sense of background on at least a measure of the training that Mr. bin Laden has been involved in.
Commercial airlines have been a part of many of the terrorist schemes tied to today's prime suspect, Osama bin Laden. According to federal court records filed by prosecutors in New York, terrorists working for bin Laden have often received training as pilots, some with U.S. pilots' licenses for large jets. In fact, some pilots say the turn the second plane seems to have made in hitting the World Trade Center today would be difficult for an amateur to carry out.
I think we have to start looking for people who were trained to fly these planes, people who knew what they were doing, because no pilot would ever fly in and destroy everybody.
As for bin Laden, after tracking him through his cell phone for several years, American intelligence officials reportedly lost track of him last year.
People at NSA told me that they had been able to eavesdrop on Osama bin Laden for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden it all went silent. They weren't able to track him anymore.
Federal prosecutors say bin Laden has a pattern of making good on his threats, and just 3 weeks ago, the Middle East Broadcasting Company reported the latest warning from bin Laden and his followers that the coming weeks would bear significant surprises during which American and Israeli interests worldwide would be targeted.
Men must send their sons to the battlefields and the fighting quarters so that they can be prepared militarily for the religion of Muhammad to triumph.
That was 3 weeks ago in the Afghan desert. Brian Ross, ABC News, New York.
Thank you, Brian Ross, for that. It's amazing. There's nowhere in the world, including John Miller's trip to Afghanistan 3.5 years ago to see Mr. bin Laden at the time. There's nowhere in the world which does not have video from it in this day and age, whether it's provided by bin Laden himself or whether on that rare and unusual occasion a Western reporter is able to get to him and sit down and question him about his intentions and his motives. To the Pentagon now, to ABC's John McCarthy. John, you have some information.
Peter,
Hang on, John.
Small signs.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, you hear me all right?
I do.
We're beginning to see the first small signs of the U.S. military positioning itself to perhaps do something in the days and weeks ahead. There was an aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, that had switched out with another aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf and was heading home. That aircraft carrier, we are now told from Pentagon sources, has been told to stop dead in the water, turn around, and head back for the Persian Gulf. That's number one. Number two, after the World Trade Center was hit and the Pentagon was hit, we now know that the Pentagon had large numbers of F-15s and F-16s on emergency alert. They moved into the airspace around New York and Washington and secured the airspace. That is the first time, to my knowledge, Peter, that has ever happened. Finally, one issue, Peter, that was raised in the President's remarks earlier this evening that is critical to those of us that watch the Pentagon and understand what some of the code is behind the words. The President said, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who did this act and those who harbor them." That is a critical statement, because what it is telling us is that the rules of engagement that America is going to go after these folks under are going to be different than it has ever been before. The United States is not going to be bound by those tight issues of collateral damage. They are not going to worry nearly as much about the loss of innocent life as they have done before. It is a very important signal that the President has laid down tonight.
We discussed that particular statement earlier, John. Does that not depend to some extent on who, if anyone, has collaborated with a terrorist, that is to say, a state?
Of course it does. But what they are saying tonight, Peter, again, to use the example of Osama bin Laden, if this is an independent terrorist operation that he may have been involved in, the signal is that the United States is going to go after the Taliban, and that is the government of Afghanistan that is harboring Osama bin Laden. But as you may recall, in other conflicts, the United States has been very, very concerned about the issue of what they call collateral damage, and that is the loss of innocent civilian life because of military strikes that the United States might take in retaliation. That is not going to be a concern, apparently, in this case, if the United States launches some sort of military attack.
Well, yet to be answered, John, whether or not the United States would suddenly change its mind about collateral damage and civilians. It's always been an essential point of pride in the United States, even when it has caused collateral damage, that this is not something a nation does easily. Let me run through these nations that are at least, and if not an issue today, at least, are you still there, John?
Yep, I'm still with you.
These nations which come up in conversation at all times like this. Iraq. The United States has thinks it's detected Saddam Hussein's hand in terrorism in the past. But there's no evidence, is there, that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden get along?
They appear to have parallel interests, Peter, but they have very, very different religious interests. Osama bin Laden does not believe in the things that Saddam Hussein does, and American officials know that they have had contacts and conversations, but the indications are that Iraq and Osama bin Laden have not been able to see eye to eye on doing anything cooperatively.
Okay, that's one. Iran. Now, Iran is very much, or principally at least, and John Cooley points this out tonight from the Middle East, is principally anti-Taliban in Afghanistan, and not likely wants to encourage either the United States Roth or Taliban factions which want to make trouble in Iran. Fair comment?
Absolutely. There has been major border disputes between the Taliban and Iran. They do not like each other. They have had casualties. They've grabbed hostages. They are not on friendly terms. And in fact, Iran has been supporting the one faction in Afghanistan that has been fighting the Taliban.
And just to keep going down the list here, with which we've been familiar down for the last couple of decades, Libya. Colonel Gaddafi, I think, is described by many people as a flake these days, and certainly in terms of search of power in Africa, or better relations in Africa, because he wants to make a stronger economic base for Libya, and has shown no signs of being involved in international terrorism in recent years. Am I correct on that?
Peter, Muammar Gaddafi is no longer seen as the kind of terrorist threat that he was before. He has lost a lot of the momentum in the drive that he was trying to do about 10 or 15 years ago. And you're absolutely correct. He wants economic legitimacy because he now sees that as the only way that his country is going to get out of the economic problems that it has had over the last decade.
And finally, two other countries which have been involved in violence. Pakistan, a very unsettled country in the world, recently been a coup, very close association with Afghanistan, at least through its security services. Cannot imagine that Pakistan would want to incur the wrath of the United States.
No, not incur the wrath, Peter, on the one hand, but Afghanistan and the Taliban are their neighbors. The Taliban and the fundamentalist Islamic movement is beginning to have an important impact on Pakistan, on certain sections of Pakistani society. So while Pakistan would never support something like this, most analysts would say they can't control it either.
In other words, Pakistan, and particularly its security services, which have been suspected of fomenting or at least cooperating with terrorism before and cooperating with drug dealing going back and forth, they're, in some respects, the loose cannon within an already unstable Pakistan.
Well, somewhat of a loose cannon, Peter. We have to be very careful that we are not accusing Pakistan of being involved in anything like this. On the other hand, the Pakistani intelligence service has supported some things that Osama bin Laden has done very covertly.
Okay, and finally, because its name is often mentioned in terms of sponsoring international terrorism, is Syria. And again, I think people we check in with today would be really surprised, if not horrified, to hear that Syria would want to incur the United States' anger to this degree.
Not considered a likely contender, but again, both Syria and Iran do play in the Israeli-Arab dispute, and the whole issue of the foment on the West Bank in Israel is something that those countries do play in, but there is no indication that that conflict is connected to what has happened today. No evidence at this moment.
Exactly, John, and thank you. You end on a particularly appropriate note, because we are simply talking at the moment in many respects, giving what I hope is legitimate background in terms of the countries which have been involved in the constant conflict involving the United States, and prior to that the United States and the Soviet Union for many years, Israel and the Palestinians, extremist Islam, not Islam by any means, extremist Islam or extremist Muslims who regard the United States as an enemy. And so that's the aim of continuing that conversation. We have no idea at the moment what the CIA or the National Security Agency or the White House actually believes at the moment in the wake of these astonishing attacks today on the trade towers and on the Pentagon outside Washington. And recall back to the reporting earlier today, one of those aircraft, Dan Harris, ABC's Dan Harris, who was out in Pennsylvania, reported that at one point the United Airlines aircraft that went down in Pennsylvania, in fact, at one point had asked for a change of flight plan for Washington. And the plane crashed shortly after that, so we have no idea what that means. And in terms of the rest of the world's concern about this, we've talked a little bit about the height of the trade towers today. The tallest building in the world currently is in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, which is the Malaysian capital. It has a name, the Petronas Towers, I think it's called. The Petronas Towers is something, two towers, much more futuristic looking than the trade towers here, but it was evacuated today in the wake of a threat to it, as were many public buildings, malls, entertainment centers, all across the United States and in many other places today. We've had a couple of visitors today, young photographers, who were closer, I think, to the aftermath of this scene in the World Trade Towers, and a great many other people who tried to get there. And we asked Connie Chung to put together a piece on the photographers today who managed to get closer than most people to what was actually happening. Here's her report.
Around 8:45 this morning, when the pilot witnessed an airplane crash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. That
In a day filled with images we may never forget, this one stands out. The extraordinary footage of an American Airlines jet slicing through the #2 tower of the World Trade Center. That image was captured by 40-year-old freelance cameraman Evan Fairbanks, who had been working 2 blocks away.
I suddenly saw a white flash from the left side of the frame, and it lasted long enough for me to be able to identify it as a jet.
When you saw that plane hitting the Trade Center tower, could you actually fathom what you were viewing?
Not at all. It was very surreal. I felt like I was in another dimension, and we weren't even on the same planet. I guess as the human stories start to emerge and we see more people and we hear more names, it'll become a lot more real to me. But right now, I feel like I'm still in the bubble of the day, and the whole experience is just kind of numbing.
Fairbanks has been a cameraman for 16 years, but today he wasn't operating on experience. It was instinct. And that's what drew him back for one last shot. That's when the tower began to collapse.
I was looking in the viewfinder, and I just saw this reverse mushroom cloud billowing down, and I realized my proximity, and immediately just turned and started running north.
But for Evan Fairbanks, this is the image that will haunt him and us for the rest of our lives.
The image of that plane just coming out of nowhere, coming into the frame, and disappearing into the south side of the tower, as if a floor had been hollowed out and it was a hangar that it was just landing in. We've seen these images in movies, and we know that it's all artificial, and Hollywood makes it. And it's hard to put together that it's real this time.
Well, and as it was real, as everybody now knows. It's interesting, in the Middle East, political leaders have asked people not to celebrate this attack on the United States. It's interesting that, even in nations which have historically had a long friendly association with the United States, including Egypt, there has been a tendency among some people who have been more profoundly politicized in the last several years to acknowledge this attack on the United States with pleasure. In Cairo, it's reported tonight that some students, taxi drivers, and shop owners actually crowded around television sets watching what was happening here and saying in Arabic, Mabruk, Mabruk, which actually means congratulations. But it's fair to say, knowing the region reasonably well, that there are a vast number of people in the Arab world who are deeply attached to the United States, a great number of people who have family living in the United States today. There are some towns on the West Bank in the Palestinian territories today, one of which comes to mind is Ramallah, this deeply troubled city in the Palestinian territory today, where more people from Ramallah historically live in the United States than do there as well. And I think that is why Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani, and certainly the political leaders in your town, living elsewhere in the country, have made a special effort today to call on people to be tolerant and understanding, and not to lay blame and let their prejudice run away with themselves, because we don't know who did this. We do not know who did this, and any tendency we may have to lean in the direction of saying that one group or the other did it quickly reminds us of what happened at Oklahoma City, when we all thought it was one thing and it turned out to be someone else. John McWethy is outside the Pentagon. John, I gather now you have what we can call a preliminary casualty figure.
It is a preliminary estimate, Peter. It comes from one of the fire chiefs who has been handling the operation here today. The Arlington County Fire Chief is saying there could be 800 dead in the Pentagon.
Can I just ask, John, could be or are?
Could be. They do not have a body count because they still do not know even how many people are really missing at this point. He made an estimate by figuring out how many people were in the area that collapsed, plus the people that were in the airplane, and that is how he came up with a figure of about 800.
Okay, thanks, John. And anything on injured at all?
None whatsoever, Peter. Although they've been going out to the hospitals in Northern Virginia as needed, several hundred, we believe.
John, as horrendous a situation it was at the Pentagon, the military is actually in a better position to assess its casualties than anybody around the trade towers. Just simply, it's got better records, know who comes to work in the place, and can check people more carefully.
Well, they have a whole plan for evacuating the Pentagon. In fact, I talked to one office that was supposed to be meeting on the helipad outside the Pentagon in case there was a problem. Of course, that's where the plane went in, so they had to assemble somewhere else. They are very organized, and the medical teams came in very rapidly, military and civilian, to this building. So they had a plan, they executed the plan. No one dreamed that they would ever have to do it because of this kind of attack, but they did it very effectively today.
Thank you, John. John McWethy at the Pentagon telling us that according to the fire chief, the Arlington fire chief, there could be could be as many as 800 people dead in the attack on the Pentagon today. And lest you lose sight of it at all, this is where an American Airlines flight, American Flight 77, which was destined from Washington Dulles originally to the West Coast, had 58 passengers and 6 crew on board. This was the aircraft, this Boeing 757, which attacked the Pentagon today. I can't think of any other words to use other than attacked. And the fear of violence continues tonight. ABC's John Miller, I gather, has just heard of an incident in New Jersey.
The New York City Police Department has a report that the FBI is responding to New Jersey because a truck reportedly loaded with explosives has been stopped by authorities on the road there, and the men with that truck have been detained. Members of the Joint Terrorist Task Force, according to the New York police officials, are responding to question those people. I want to underline that all the phones to police headquarters and to the FBI from here seem to be disabled. So sorting through these reports to get specifics, to sort them out, can sometimes take time. But this is information that is in the possession of the police department, comes from the FBI, and we don't know the exact significance of it.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Well, I guess it's also clear to people now that ABC News is going to stay on the air for an indefinite period of time. For a variety of reasons, of course. One is to continue reporting the news, which is our job, and secondly because of something that an American historian once said to me many years ago, that the television set is roughly equivalent to a campfire in the days as the wagon trains were making their way westward, and there was a catastrophe on the trail, and so people pulled the wagons around and sat down and discussed what went on and tried to understand it, and then went on the next day. And we do that in front of our television sets now in large measure today. We did it, you'll recall, at the time of the Challenger. We did it when President Kennedy was assassinated. We've done it in any number of incidents, whether we're working on television or watching television or contributing to it in some way. This is in some respects the national campfire, to use that analogy. And one of the things we try to do at the moment is to reach out and, not in any scientific way, try to understand how people are feeling about this. Not just the man on the street interviews, which we'll get to in just a second, they're so important, but in terms of trying to understand what people's attitudes are about things. And so we did a poll. An ABC News poll has already been conducted, one of them. And you may find it interesting. One of the questions asked, did the United States do all it could, reasonably could, excuse me, to prevent these attacks? And there's a split right down the middle. 43% say yes, and 44% say no. Here's something very interesting. We asked people whether or not they had confidence in the United States to find and punish those who were responsible. And we asked people whether they were very confident or somewhat confident, and quite an astonishing 91% said yes, and only 9% said they had little or no confidence. Were people willing to give up some liberties? It's been a point of discussion throughout the day. Were people willing to give up some liberties to support a crackdown on terrorism? 66% in this poll, very quick poll. It's a limited number of people, only 600 people interviewed, plus or minus 4%, all those usual admonitions about it. But 66% of people said they would support sacrificing some of their liberties in order to crack down on international terrorism, on terrorism in general, and 24% said no. Would you support military action against groups or actions responsible? 94% said yes, and 3% said no. Would you support military reprisals even if it could mean war? And maybe this is not a surprise in the intensity of these early hours. 86% said yes, and 7% said no. Fair to point out that none of us have any understanding of what a definition of war is at the moment. The last time the United States went to war was in the Persian Gulf, and it was by conventional war standards, it was fairly casualty free for the United States, and we didn't even do as much, the United States didn't do as much damage to the Iraqis as they had originally anticipated. Concerned about future terrorist attacks here? Back to the poll very briefly. 2 more questions, Sandy. Concerned about future terrorist attacks here? 87% of the people we asked said yes. Seems like a sensible answer given what's happened today, and 12% said no. And worried? And this is where we've talked extensively today, or not extensively, but occasionally, about the effect on the national psychology. Are you worried, or someone, you or someone close to you, may be victimized? And 47% said yes, and 52% said no. So that's what we find in an early poll from our polling institute today, asking those very obvious questions in the wake of these attacks in New York and outside Washington today. Those voices from the street are very, very important. Here's Charlie Gibson with a report on them.
All emergency workers around the city are on call. There is mayhem and chaos, people running everywhere. A clear late summer day turns into what feels like a nuclear winter.
Nobody has any visibility.
People are caught in the tower, hanging out of windows, some jumping 80 floors to their deaths. Others hoping, praying to be rescued. As men and women head down, trying to flee the building, firefighters are racing up to do their job, only to become the first victims.
We better get out of the way!
Then, incredibly, Tower 1 comes tumbling, cascading down.
See you later.
Some of the emergency workers who managed to make it out need to be treated themselves. Fire union officials say of the first 400 firefighters on the scene, 200 are missing, probably killed. Meanwhile, there are reports at the White House that the Pentagon has been hit. A spokesman for the Pentagon said he had no firm number of casualties as firefighters struggled to contain the blaze. At 10:30 Eastern Time, the second World Trade Center tower collapses. And minutes later, a full-scale state of emergency is declared in New York.
The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible.
Police officers do everything they can to evacuate downtown Manhattan. The scene quickly turns to triage. Initial reports say at least 2,100 people have been injured, 600 of them taken to hospitals by mid-afternoon, 5 dead on arrival. 1,500 more walking wounded were taken across New York Harbor to New Jersey's Liberty State Park, and dozens of ambulances raced there as well. Meanwhile, uptown, hundreds turned out to give blood, some waiting 2 or 3 hours at blood donation centers. And then late afternoon, 5 p.m., still another building collapses. 7 World Trade Center, ruined by falling debris from the Twin Towers. But overall, there are some stories of lives saved.
As we came downstairs, we were just dragging people along with us.
At the Pentagon, workers continued through the early evening to contain the fire and smoke, but can't get to ground zero, where officials fear many are dead, including the passengers and crew from the American Airlines plane. One of those known passengers was Barbara Olson, the wife of the Solicitor General of the United States, Ted Olson. At this hour, where the World Trade Center once stood, casualties are expected to be overall in the thousands.
Mrs. Olson, who is widely known to viewers of cable and to network television around the country, is the only, to the best of my knowledge, the only person who we have publicly identified today who has been killed. And that, of course, is because, as Charlie Gibson has pointed out before, Mrs. Olson was in contact with her husband, the Solicitor General of the United States, while she was on a plane that had been taken over by terrorists. But as we heard from Mayor Giuliani earlier, and we heard from Governor Pataki, in part because, excuse me just one second, okay, in part because New York State and New York City have offices in the trade towers, and because Mayor Giuliani simply knows so many people in New York City, they know that friends and associates have been killed, and people in many, many parts of the country, without any doubt, know people who have worked in the trade towers or had offices in trade towers. And it is those people sitting on the edges of their seats tonight, perhaps desperately trying to get through to those government hotlines, which we put up on several occasions, that we will put up again as the evening ensues, desperately trying to seek information. And we don't have any in a personal way yet. The hospitals in Lower Manhattan have been to some extent overwhelmed. You see these scenes on the street as well as we do And so you can appreciate just how enormously difficult it is at the moment to get to the point of identifying people on the ground. It has been easier and desperately sad for people who knew other people traveling on the 4 aircraft that were involved in these incidents today, because there are passenger manifestos. And we know that the airlines have, over the years, improved tremendously their capacity to get in touch with relatives. Do you remember after TWA 800 there was something of a scandal? TWA was under tremendous pressure because the families of those people involved literally went out to Kennedy Airport and stood around desperately demanding information about their friends and relatives who were on that flight. And the airlines have become much better. So people, and 266 people, we believe, were killed on those 4 aircraft today. 266 passengers and crew flying on those flights, which were taken over by terrorists and then directed at these essential American targets today. Now, it's just a little before 8 o'clock in the western part of the United States today, and in a short while from now in the eastern part of the United States, some of the local television stations, our affiliates up and down the country, will be breaking away. We'll come back in a minute, but I want to check in with Cynthia McFadden, who's been down at the Chelsea Piers, right on the river, on the Hudson River, on the west side of Manhattan. And Cynthia, you have been waiting expectantly all day, because this was the place, or this still is the place, where people are expected to be brought?
This still is officially placed, Peter, the place where people will be brought. However, we've just been told unofficially, but it appears truly, that doctors are going to be dispatched to Ground Zero. At this point, victims are trapped in the rubble, and they're sending a team of doctors to perform amputations at the site. And the reason this place is empty, filled with doctors and nurses, but not with victims, is because the victims can't get here. So they're sending a team of doctors to the site.
Cynthia, has anybody shown up there today at all? There's been this long line of ambulances behind you.
Indeed, there have been victims brought here, but most of them not severely injured. They are still expecting a massive influx of victims, Peter. And this site still stands ready with 50 operating rooms inside. But at this point, they are going to dispatch teams to perform amputations on the site.
Okay, Cynthia, thanks very much. 50 operating opportunities at Chelsea. This is this enormous sports entertainment center on the west side of Manhattan, which has been turned into a disaster preparation area at the moment, and the federal government and the state government and the city and hospitals and volunteers from every aspect of the medical community have descended on these locations tonight to be ready, lest they are able to help. Governor Pataki and the mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, said a short while ago they've got enough volunteers at the moment, but the reason that the governor called for doctors, I'm going to dig through my notes here and see if I can find that number again. The reason that the governor of New York said that they were put up a couple of phone numbers was because he made it very clear that while they have enough doctors at the moment, even though the tremendous pressure on the hospitals in lower New York particularly, and burn victims have been taken to a variety of centers in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and as far north as Canada, not very far north when you think about it, to be treated. There is going to be a need for the people to be relieved, and so the governor offered this number for doctors who wish to volunteer their services. 518 is for doctors. 518-431-7600, 7600. And he also gave us another number for nurses. Shortage of nurses, as everybody knows, and he gave a number for nurses who wish to volunteer as 1-800-628-0193. 1-800-628-0193. This is not to imply a shortage of doctors or nurses at the moment. As Cynthia McFadden says, there are 50 operating theaters. 50 operating theaters set up in this huge sports complex, as close as you can reasonably get to the World Trade Center. It's very close indeed on the West Side Highway that goes down the west side of Manhattan, who are there prepared to help. That is that skeleton of the front facade of the lower part of one of the trade centers. And we've seen this many times, this horrendous result of the power of the collapse of at least one of the trade towers in and of itself, when the intense fire started when these two large commercial aircraft went into these planes, caused such fire, aided by aviation fuel, so that the steel simply couldn't stand it, melted, collapsed on itself, and then simply collapsed floor by floor down to the bottom. So we will pause for a few seconds while some stations on the eastern part of the United States go to local news. ABC News is staying right here.
And it just slammed right into it and was completely engulfed.
Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack.
And about the time I saw the plane, I watched it come in very low over the trees, and it just dipped down, came down right over 395, right into the Pentagon.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
This is a special report from ABC 7 News, America Under Attack.
It's a terrorist attack that has killed thousands of people. Good evening, I'm Maureen Bunyan.
And I'm Kathleen Matthews. Thanks for joining us. It's been more than 12 hours now since terrorist attacks rocked New York City and the nation's capital. Still tonight, in the smoldering wreckage of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the devastation is not fully realized. There's, of course, shock, fear, sadness, and anger as we wait for the final toll this attack has taken on the lives and the spirit of a nation.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve.
Those words of comfort and condolence from President Bush tonight to a nation in shock. This after the most heinous attacks of terrorism to ever hit America. It was 8:45 a.m. when a hijacked American Airlines jet slammed into one of the World Trade Towers. Almost as soon as this tragedy was comprehended, at 9:03, a second hijacked jetliner hit the second World Trade Tower, confirming the nation's suspicion that this was no accident. The attacks came in waves, the next one hitting at 9:40 a.m. This time the target was close to home. It was the Pentagon. The weapon, a hijacked American Airlines plane going from our own Dulles Airport to Los Angeles.
Out of nowhere, you just saw a plane real low and just went straight, didn't come in from high, came in real low, and just the back end of the Pentagon just blew it up, big mushroom fire cloud. Insane. The Pentagon attack sent the Washington area into a panic, with the White House, Capitol, and all federal buildings being evacuated. Nationwide, all flights were grounded, and travel in America came to a standstill.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way! Then, a tragedy that was already incomprehensible was made worse. At 9:50, the first World Trade Center tower collapsed, with ash and soot blanketing Manhattan.
Oh my God, this is so terrible.
At 9:58, a man holed up in the bathroom of a United Airlines flight from Newark to San Francisco called and said his plane had been hijacked. And a few minutes later, that plane crashed into a field outside of Pittsburgh.
No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on.
At 10:29, the unthinkable happened again. The second World Trade Center tower collapsed, and the shock and dismay that America was feeling was beginning to turn to anger and a demand for justice.
This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time.
At a time like this, the nation looks to its leader for guidance and strength. And at the end of our newscast, we're going to bring you the president's speech in its entirety. Maureen?
Kathleen, tonight we're getting an estimate on the number of casualties from today's attack on the Pentagon, and it is not pretty. Arlington County officials tell us there may be between 100 and 800 bodies still in the rubble of the Pentagon. As far as injuries are concerned, we know that so far 81 people have been treated today at area hospitals. Kathleen?
Pentagon officials tonight say when emergency crews finish their work, there will be many casualties. Hundreds of workers were inside the nation's military headquarters this morning when the plane crashed into the building. American Flight 77 was hijacked at our own Dulles Airport and then taken to the Pentagon. With 64 passengers on board, terrorists crashed the plane into the northeast side of the building. Tonight, the fire is still burning at the Pentagon, and our live team coverage continues with ABC 7 News reporter Daryl Carver, who's live on the scene. Daryl, what's the latest from there?
Well, we just got those same staggering numbers from Arlington County fire officials. Anywhere from 100 to 800 people dead inside the Pentagon. Now, we had the opportunity to go inside the Pentagon earlier tonight for the press briefing. The press room is about 2 corridors away from where the plane actually landed inside the building. There was still a stench of fire and smoke throughout that building.
I was up in the air traffic control tower, and the soldier went downstairs to the restroom. And I just look out the side of the building, I see a plane run right into the side of the Pentagon. And when it did, the whole ceiling and everything just fell. So
9:30 this morning, a workday like no other started in the Pentagon, with defense workers being evacuated as rescue workers tried to put the flames from the crash out. Both civilian and military volunteers rushed to the heavily damaged E-ring to help the injured. Among those helping was Stephen Hall, a worker at a nearby building in Crystal City.
There were squads of 4 people with the stretchers, and they would give us instructions as to how it would actually occur. You know, the 4 people, how you would get the bodies onto there, the identification process itself, where you write it, where the positions would be, and where would they be transported to.
Well, we know there were large number, many dozens in the aircraft that flew at full power, steering directly into between I think the first and second floor of the opposite the helipad. You've seen it. There cannot be any survivors. It just would be beyond comprehension.
As defense officials try to account for those missing or dead, they promise retribution for attacks here and in New York, delivering tough words but stopping short of calling this an act of war.
This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history. And yet I think it can be its finest hour.
Despite the damage left behind, officials promise the Pentagon will reopen